Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Farr Library and another program. I'm Kevin Cook, local naturalist, lived in the area for about 40 years. And a number of years ago, I started doing monthly programs where I set a theme for the month and then divide it into 12 topics and do one program a month. And so far, in 8 months this year, we've managed to squeeze in about 3 to 4 of those. I hope you're all doing well. It's a little strange not having you out here, but I'm pretty sure somebody's out there listening. Always my programs have something to do with nature, wildlife, natural history, because that's just who I am and that's my passion in life. This year, what my theme has been so far is becoming a naturalist. And the stories on a month-to-month basis have been about things that really influenced going toward that naturalist thing as opposed to end up being a butcher, baker, or candlestick maker. So today, what we're going to be talking about is Becoming a Moose, Session 4, Tracking Moose through Colorado. This has become kind of a big deal for me, and we're going to explain more of why I got into moose as we go along. But there's so much to this story that I really feel like we need a good chronology to make everything sort of fit into place. So we're going to go back before the moose thing and start with something else in 1910. In 1910, the subject was elk. By 1910, the best estimates in the state of Colorado that we only had about 1,000 elk left statewide. Now understand, the elk as a species naturally occurred all the way from the Atlantic coast all the way to the Pacific coast. And even though they were scattered and sort of spotty, they were still out on the Great Plains. But by 1750, they had been completely eliminated east of the Mississippi River. There were none left by 1750. And when people started coming to Colorado, elk were a major source of food for the labor supply. The laborers in the mines, the laborers on the railroads, in the logging companies, in the buildings. And meals of elk meat were part of the pay that they got for the work that they did. Well, this went on for 30 or 40 years until the point came there weren't enough elk left to sustain people. So in 1912, there was this coalition of people. And one of the real movers behind it was none other than Phelan Stanley, the famous F.O. Stanley of the Stanley Hotel in Estes Park and the Stanley Steamer. He wanted to have a reason for people to come to Estes Park and stay at the hotel, and the elk were gone. So he put up the money, and arrangements were made in this coalition between the federal government, the Forest Service, and the state of Wyoming and the state of Colorado and some private groups. And they worked together, and over the next, it was 5, 6, 10 years, they brought about 300 to 350 moose down, or elk down from Wyoming, and they turned them loose in various places around Colorado, including Estes Park, one of the first releases. And so now we have reestablished elk in the state of Colorado, and in 2020, the population vacillates between about 165,000 and about 185,000 or so. So we've done a good job of bringing them back. That brings us to 1918. And another species in trouble, the pronghorn, an animal unique to North America. It doesn't live on any other continent. And by 1918, the best estimates were we had fewer than 1,000 pronghorns left. So within a year or so, a pronghorn refuge was established, and that existed up north of Fort Collins, not too far from where the Rawhide Energy Station is today. And this was decided that they weren't recovering on their own fast enough. So by 1939, the decision was made to relocate pronghorn from where they were okay, mostly northern Larimer County and Weld County, and disperse them around the state. And what's amazing is before ecology and animal behavior and population dynamics were really understood, the people who did this managed to do everything almost perfectly, because instead of just trapping a few animals here and there, they trapped entire social units and they moved the whole social unit to a new place and turned it loose. So the bucks and the does and the fawns all recognized each other, and it worked perfectly. And today, in 2020, our pronghorn population statewide vacillates between about 90,000 and about 105,000. They've done a great job of recovering. That brings us to 1949 and something altogether different: mountain goats. No evidence, no fossil evidence, no subfossil evidence, no old bones, no old fur, nothing biological or ecological confirms that mountain goats ever occurred in the state of Colorado. But one of the confusing things is that people who don't really know wildlife and understand relatedness, they would refer to bighorn sheep as mountain goats. And so it got to be confusing in the early days. But the idea was, bring the mountain goats here. I mean, they brought in 9 from Montana in 1949, and they turned them loose in the Saguache Range, and they did just fine. So then 5 years later, they brought in 6 more from Montana, and they did fine. So a few years later, they brought in 11 from Idaho and 5 from South Dakota, and these they turned loose on Mount Evans, west of Denver. And from there, we now have a population of about 6,000 mountain goats statewide. One of the things to understand about this, and with the Moose Project that we'll be talking about in a minute, is that all of this wasn't just a free exchange sort of thing, where these states were giving us these things. There were exchanges. Like in South Dakota, we gave them turkeys so they could reestablish turkeys in South Dakota, and they gave us the mountain goats so they could lower the population in the Black Hills. That brings us to 1962, and this is where my part of the story kicks in. In 1962, I got to see my first moose. It was fabulous. My family, my mom, my dad, one of my elder brothers, and myself, we were driving from Des Moines, Iowa to Tacoma, Washington, and then we were going to see the Seattle World's Fair, and we were camping our way. And so to get from Iowa to Washington, we ended up by going through Yellowstone National Park, and there it was, a moose out in a meadow. And I had this feeling of, this is real. Oh my gosh, this isn't just pictures in books and magazines. The moose is a real animal, and look how big it is. And I knew right away that I was going to have to see more moose. There had to be a way that a guy like me could engage moose more often than a trip once every 10 years. Then things began to change, and there was another big event in my life, but this one wasn't nearly as happy. It was 1964, and I had a major headbutting episode with a 7th grade history teacher. It was humiliating, it was degrading, it was aggravating, and there was nothing I could do about it. And my response as a young teenager was, to heck with history, who needs it? There's nothing you can do to force me to learn history. And so I ignored it almost my whole life. And that's how I dealt with things. Moving on, a few years later, it's 1967, and a magazine article appeared. It was in Colorado Outdoors, and it was authored by a fellow named Richard Denny, who was a biologist with the Colorado Game, Fish, and Parks. And for a year or two, he had been talking about the idea of bringing moose to Colorado. Well, if we could succeed with elk, and we could succeed with pronghorn, and we could succeed with mountain goats, then why not moose? And so in 1967, with this magazine article, it went from being a subject to talk about to being an idea to pursue, and it progressed from there. Before we got to the moose, though, it's 1974, and I had my first chance to go to sea where I found whales, specifically the Pacific gray whale. For a kid from Iowa, seeing a whale was absolutely fabulous, and getting in a little 16-foot boat and almost being able to reach it, just reaching out, and I'm almost there but can't quite touch it. Oh my gosh, it was fabulous. And I learned a little bit about whaling to go along with what I learned about whales. Then it's 1975, and I'm going back for my second trip to see whales because I broke my camera on the first trip and I wanted to have pictures for memories. So I read up some more and studied a bit, and I began to take seals and sea lions and whales and dolphins a lot more seriously because I was learning about the history of the human interaction with those species and what the tragic consequences were in terms of population decline. What was happening to the whales and the seals and the sea lions was the same thing that was happening to the elk and the pronghorn in Colorado years before. So I started reading. I started reading about not just whales, but also whaling. I started reading not just about seals, but about sealing. And then I got into sea turtles. And all of this led to, in the 70s, we had this issue about bald eagle decline. And in the reading about all of these things, the subject that kept coming up was specimen collecting for private collectors and for museums and universities and colleges, and the toll that specimen collecting took. These were topics of history that were never discussed in any of the history classes I ever had to take. And yet I found it incredibly fascinating to find out what we had been doing and how it had this effect on the wildlife that shared this planet with us. And in 1975, I learned about whooping cranes. They were pictures of birds in my bird books, but I'd never seen one. I had no idea how big they were. But the idea came up that if we didn't do something to save them, they were going to disappear like so many other things had. So an idea came up to take eggs out of the nest in Canada and put them into the nest of sandhill cranes in Idaho to the west of Grand Teton National Park, and let the sandhill cranes raise them in a separate, isolated flock. Well, this got me interested, and I started asking questions and found out those sandhill cranes that nest in Idaho, when they migrate south in the autumn of the year, they come through western Colorado. So there was a chance that I could find them where I was living at the time in Gunnison. So one day I ended up by going down to the San Luis Valley to see some of these whooping cranes, and I actually found them, and it was remarkable. Here was a story of a species we almost lost, and we were working to recover it. We had made the decision to do the right thing the way we had with elk and with pronghorn, and it was, to me, it was an amazing story of the history between humanity and life on Earth. Then it's the year later, and I managed to convince people to pay me to take them down to the San Luis Valley and show them these whooping cranes. And I got into the wildlife touring business doing that. But that same year, actually the year after, but that year I started promoting it, I started in promoting my own whale watching tour to Baja, and I actually got enough people go to make it work. But in '76, another thing came up. That's when the official proposal was submitted to establish moose in Colorado. We had to have an environmental assessment report to explain what impacts this big plant-eating animal would have on the national forests and on pasture lands. And in this report, there were some obstacles that were noted, and specifically, ranchers opposed the idea of bringing in a big animal that was going to eat the same food that their livestock needed. and they weren't really happy about the idea of a big animal like this damaging fences and causing them to incur costs to repair those fences. And the state legislature, our General Assembly, said, yes, it's okay to do this, but you're not going to take any of your regular funds, and we're not going to appropriate any funds. So you're going to have to come up with your own money in order to pay for this project. Well, when all the details were worked out, in order to get a helicopter to lift a moose and put it into a crate so it could be trucked from Utah into Idaho, it was $300 a moose. And so they needed $15,000. The resolutions were the Safari Club of Denver. Safari Club is an international trophy hunting organization and big game hunting organization with a chapter in Denver. They held a raffle and managed to raise $11,000. And they ended up by paying for the liability insurance that had to be up to $1 million, so that if the moose got into a rancher's haystack and damaged it or damaged a fence, then the rancher could claim this against the state and this insurance would pay for it. So the Safari Club International came up with the funds to do that. And then private donors, not really that many, only about a dozen to 15 of them, they contributed enough other money to meet the $15,000 that was needed in order to make the whole project go ahead. The report was accepted, everything was approved, and our wildlife people went from Colorado over to Utah to capture the moose in this place where they gathered in the winter because the snowfall made them aggregate in this place, but it was not a good year. The snow was almost absent and the moose weren't congregating, so they had to give up on it in 1977. But they went back in 1978, and in 78, I made my fourth and last trip to Baja, and this is where things really began to come together in that fitting the pieces together. In my last trip to Baja, I went almost 200 miles out to sea to a place called Guadalupe Island. In the past, the Mexican government had used this as a penal colony, the way the French had done with islands off of the coast of South America, and the Spanish and others, even the British. And here you can see one of the original buildings that was left from those penal colony days. But that wasn't the saddest part to me. In preparing for this trip, what I learned was that there was a falcon that had lived on this island, and it had gone extinct, and it had gone extinct for two reasons. One, as I learned by reading about these things, there were goats on the island, but goats were not natural there, and the way the goats got there is in the early days of exploration, sailors figured out it's a long ways from landfall to landfall where you can get more food. And salted pork and hardtack gets to be pretty boring eating. And so on into the 17 and 1800s, the expeditioners would take pigs and goats and turn them loose on the islands. And then when they came back through on the way home or on subsequent expeditions, they could stop on the islands, get wood for fires, fresh water, and they could shoot goats and pigs for fresh meat. And in that way, goats ended up on Guadalupe Island. Well, by the 1880s, the Mexican government had the idea that they could harvest the goats for meat. And so they had goat herds on the island to watch over the goats, and they built facilities for killing and then processing the goats and canning the meat so it could be marketed worldwide. Well, people saw these falcons, known as the Guadalupe caracara, eating dead goats, and they assumed that if the falcon was eating the goat, then the falcon killed the goat. There's no biological way that a 2.5 or 3 pound falcon is going to kill a 100-pound goat. They were eating carrion. The goats were dying from other causes, and the caracaras were coming in and feeding on the carcasses. but the goat herds were shooting them without any restraint. And then there were collectors that went to the island and shot them. And by 1910, there were no Guadalupe caracaras left alive. And so I show up in 1978, and there are goat skulls all over the island. I mean, there were as many goat skulls on Guadalupe Island in 1978 as there are Starbucks coffee cups in a Walmart parking lot. And yet, for all the goat skulls that I saw and the goats that were still there, there were no caracaras. And as I thought about this in terms of all these other things I had learned about, the disappearance of Atlantic gray whales, gone because of whaling, and no more great auks and passenger pigeons, the dodos that I had learned about. Now suddenly extinction wasn't just something that dinosaurs did in ancient times. It was something that humanity was imposing on life on Earth. And when I began to think of it that way, I just collapsed down on the island and I cried for about a half an hour. That it could be that sad the way humanity treats life on Earth. And history started becoming important to me. Studying the details of Guadalupe caracaras and what happened to them, what happened to the gray whales, and was still happening. And the northern elephant seals that used to be so abundant, it was unimaginable, and they were down to maybe a dozen animals by the 1930s. All of this, learning about them, inducted me into that academic realm of wildlife history. And at the same time, the moose was making history right here in Colorado. In 1978, after that first year, 1977, where the moose didn't cooperate and the weather wasn't right, we went back, and the first attempt wasn't successful because they were darting the moose with a tranquilizing drug, but the moose weren't responding because it wasn't strong enough. So they had to shut down the operation and recalibrate how much it was going to take to anesthetize the moose so they could net them, measure them, weigh them, and get them lifted and put into the cabinet. So they went back a month later, and the tranquilizers worked. And on March 14th, they were able to capture 6 of the animals, 1 bull, 4 cows, and a calf. And they got them moved to Colorado. All of them went to the Illinois River headwaters, which are in the southeast part of North Park. So it's east of Rand, southeast of Walden, and back up into the flanks of the Never Summer Mountains over there. And that's where they had this compound of 2 acres with chain link fencing around it so they could release the moose, let them recover from the tranquilizer, and kind of get their wits about them. They're in a new place before they let them out to go on their own. 3 days later, they caught 4 more moose and moved those. And then on the 18th, they caught 2 more, both bulls, and they moved those and turned them loose. So when you read the reports and the histories and the magazine accounts and all that, they tell you they moved 12 moose. Well, nothing's ever that simple. When they turned loose one of the bulls, it tried to go through the fencing, and it got chain link fencing stuck on its antler. And for the next 2 weeks, it was dragging around chain link fencing wherever it went. And the fencing finally came off when the antler fell off, which they normally do at that time of the year. But the biologists were sort of debating back and forth. Should we anesthetize it? Should we knock it out and take the chain off? Or should we just see if it comes off? And finally, the antler shedding took care of that. But one of the things that was never talked about, and this was explained to me by the biologists who were actually involved, and it was one of the cows that they moved died. And they were afraid that if they included that in the report, there would be such a negative kickback from the public, they would be forced to terminate the project. So they didn't report that the cow had died. And so it's not in the archives, it's not in the reports or the history accounts. So I can't be sure whether they actually moved 13 moose and one died or they moved 12 and one died, but it's something in there. It's those background stories that sort of flesh things out in the history of the whole thing. All of these came from the Uinta Mountain Range in Utah. Excuse me. And the way we got the moose from Utah is we gave them some bighorn sheep and they gave us some moose. A year later, 12 more moose were brought in, but all of these were captured in Grand Teton National Park in Wyoming. And so that brought the total to about 24 moose that had been released in 2 years. So before we go any farther, just exactly what is a moose? If I were to give you a quiz, could you get a passing score on this? Let's find out what you know. In terms of its classification and the naming of it, the nomenclature that tells us the relatedness. I mean, what animals are related to moose and what animals aren't related to moose. We look at things in terms of what class they're in, and the classes subdivide into orders. The orders subdivide into families. The families subdivide into subfamilies, and so on. So it turns out the moose is in the class Mammalia. Those are the mammals. The females produce milk, and they all produce true hair from a follicle in the skin, and they have internal skeletons, that sort of thing. Within the mammals, there are maybe 19, 20, 22 orders, and one order is called Artiodactyla, and that's the group that includes all of the rumens, the animals that have a chambered stomach, and most of them, but not all of them, have hooves. So you have cattle and antelope, sheep, goats, bison, buffalo, those are all Artiodactylids. Within that order, there are several families, and one of the family is the Cervidae. Those are the deer. What makes them stand out as being different is instead of horns, they have antlers. And only species in that family produce antlers. So if the animal has antlers, it's got to be in that family. So they not only have antlers, but they also have chambered stomachs, and they are able to ruminate. Then the genus of the moose is Alces. For a long time, it was thought the North American moose was different than the moose from Europe and Asia. And if you read about this, you'll find out that over in Europe, the name for the animal was elk. And then when people came to North America from Europe, they saw elk over here, and they started calling them elk. And we started calling our moose, and there's the language thing for you. So they thought the one in North America was different than the one in Europe and Asia, and then they decided, no, they've got to be the same thing. So for a long time, they were consolidated as one species. But now, with genetics testing and looking at all sorts of proteins and things, the idea is they really are two different species, but it's not just one continent to the next. There's a north-south river in Siberia, and everything to the east and Siberia and going on over across the Bering Strait into Alaska and across North America, that's one species. And then everything west of that river and going all the way over into Europe, that's the other species. So we have Americanus, and it's divided anywhere from 2 to 4 subspecies, depending on whose authority you go by. The one that was brought to Colorado is referred to as the Shiras moose because it was named after a fellow named George Shiras III. He was born in 1859 in Allegheny, Pennsylvania. He died in 1942 in Marquette, Michigan. He was educated originally at Cornell University in New York and got a law degree from what was then Yale College. And he practiced law in Pittsburgh for quite a few years. Then in 1889, he was elected as a state representative to the General Assembly of Pennsylvania. And then a few years later, he was elected to Congress as a representative from Pennsylvania. but he never went farther than that with his politicking. But one of the things he was famous for in the 1890s and on into the 1900s, he developed special techniques of flash photography in order to photograph wildlife at night, and National Geographic magazine became a #1 outlet for his photography. And eventually, National Geographic magazine recognized him for his remarkable contributions, and they even cited him as being the father of wildlife photography and the father of flash photography of wildlife as well. Well, in his wildlife photography work, George Shiras III went all over everywhere, including to Yellowstone National Park. And while he was in Yellowstone, he noticed the moose there were smaller than the moose he had encountered in Canada and other places. And as the biologists got to looking at it, they decided he was right. And so they named the subspecies after him, Shirasi, and that's how it came to be known as the Shiras moose. Same species as the American or the Eastern moose, but a specific subspecies, the smallest of all the mooses in the whole world. So some more moose details for you. Size. The Shiras moose is the smallest one. Females, around here, they're typically going around 700 to 800, a few hundred more pounds. The males are generally around 950, and a really big one is 1,200. When you get to the moose up in Alaska and over in Asia, those big bulls can reach 2,000 pounds. That's a ton. That's a lot of animal. The distribution of them here in the United States is all across Alaska and all across Canada, clear to the Labrador Peninsula, but they don't go all the way up into the Arctic. They'll wander up there, but the tree line is kind of there. That's as far as I want to go. And then in Europe, they've been reintroduced in Scotland. I don't know how well that's gone. I don't know if they've survived and repopulated. They're in Scandinavia, parts of Russia, Poland, and Germany, Belarus, and Latvia, but they haven't reestablished in all the other areas where they used to be and got hunted out. In terms of where they live, it's not just a geography thing, but it's a biogeography thing. Because of what they eat and because of their size and color, they need two very specific things. They need plant life to eat, and then they need shade to get out of the sun during the day, because as big as they are and as dark as they are, they can heat up in the sun and they need to stay cool. So during the day, they get back into forested areas where the tree canopy overhead causes the temperature below to be many degrees cooler than out in the open. And that's how they stay cool on hot days. So they need those forests. But then they also need a lot of food. One bull Shiras elk at 1,000 pounds can eat around 25 pounds of willow twigs every single day. And so they need access to the right kinds of foods. So they sort of wander between open areas where they eat and forested areas where they bed down to chew the cud and process what they've eaten and to stay cool. Longevity-wise, this is a big animal that lives a long time. Animals that have been marked with ear tags or collars put on them, they routinely live over 20 years. Diet-wise, they're plant eaters. About 70 to 80%, it depends on which moose you're talking about, which part of its range. Mostly, they're eating the twigs of willows and the willow relatives known as poplars, cottonwoods, and aspens. They'll eat a little bit of tree bark, but not as much as elk. They eat some wildflowers, a little bit of grass. They love aquatic plants, and they'll even eat algae. But that only accounts for about 20, 25% of their diet. And for some, it may be as low as 15% of the diet. But what's amazing is a moose eats about 80% of its entire food for a calendar year. It eats it in about 3.5 months, June, July, and August into September. And then from mid-September into May, they back off and they only eat just kind of enough to say it's eating, but it's only 20% of the diet that other 8.5 months out of the year. Behavior-wise, you get a lot of stories about moose being aggressive and how moose are really dangerous, and there are quite a few moose attacks, and actually more people are attacked by moose than any other large animal in North America, way more than wolves and even bears. But it's not always the moose that's involved, and when you look at the information, the reports that go with the records, people do some dumb things, trying to get selfies on the smartphone and get closer, and can you feed the moose by hand? And you never know what's happened to that moose. And so when they defend themselves or get assertive, then people associate that with the animal being aggressive instead of the people being dumb. I have had about 200 moose encounters in the state of Colorado in the last 35, 40 years, and I have yet to have a moose get aggressive with me. The most amazing one was, I was in the Kawanichi Valley of Rocky Mountain National Park, and I was scouting for orchids because I was going to be teaching an orchid seminar up there, and I wanted to know where the orchids were before I took the class out in the field. So I'm kind of looking down, and I'm looking under the willows, and I'm kind of stooped over and even down on my hands and knees a little bit, because these orchids can be hidden in other plant life and under the willows. And suddenly I hear this snorting, and I hear this huffing, and then I hear something like chewing. And when I look up, here is a full-grown, well-developed bull elk bedded down in the shade of this forest area along the Colorado River, chewing its cud, and it's watching me, and I'm only 20 feet away. And it didn't get up. It expected me to go around it, and I did. That's my closest encounter, but just 2 or 3 years ago, I had a moose follow me. I was looking in this one particular place that I go to regularly in Rocky Mountain National Park, because it's got a really nice aggregation of ferns and orchids and other wildflowers, and I check on it 3-4 times every summer. And on my way in, right at the edge, maybe 150 feet from the road where I parked, there's a moose. And it's just browsing away on the willows in the area. So I kind of skirt around it and give it some distance and keep on going. And I hear something, and I turn and look over my shoulder, and the moose is following me. And I stop, and it stopped, and it just chewed. So I kept going, and it followed me again, and I stopped again. And on the third time, I took about 3 steps toward it, and it backed up and turned like it was going to go away, and I figured this isn't going to go anywhere. So I just went ahead and did my plant search and looked for my ferns and my orchids, and the moose just stood off there and watched me for a little while and finally decided I was kind of boring or something, and he wandered off, and I didn't see him again until I came back the next time, and we did it all over again. I've been followed by a moose. People say that they don't see well, that they're nearly blind, and this is simply not true. They have good anatomy to their eyes, and I've sort of tested them. When I've seen them on a far side of a meadow, I can take off a scarf or a bright t-shirt or get something and wave it way over my head, and it'll make the moose turn, and its ears will come around, and it will lift its nose and look in my direction. And if it couldn't see me, it wouldn't do that. And I might be a half a mile away. And so I am absolutely convinced that the idea that moose can't see well is just folklore that gets passed along, but it has no biological support to it whatsoever. So now you know about moose. It's now 1982, and 20 years later, I finally saw my second and third moose. It only took 20 years. But I finally saw them up in North Park, and it was one of those things, I have got to understand the story about bringing moose to Colorado. And that's what really motivated me to sit down in the libraries, at the archives, and go through the records and learn the story. In 1985, there were enough mooses established in Colorado, they gave out 5 licenses to hunt them. And things just progressed from there. Now, all these years later, we're up to over 200 licenses a year. In 1987, a third translocation was done. 11 moose were taken from Wyoming and released in the Laramie River Valley near the Stubb Creek Ranger Station. Now, that word I just used, translocation, that is the correct biological term, ecological term, wildlife management term. When you dig a plant up here and you move the plant over there and put it back in the ground, you have transplanted it. When you trap an animal where it occurs here and you move it and turn it loose over there, you didn't transplant it, you translocated it. But that's a term that you almost never hear, which is why you people need me. In 1991, a big deal was done. It was agreed that the moose were not dispersing through Colorado as fast as it was thought they might. And so it was approved to help nudge them along. And in 1991, 5 moose were trapped in North Park, and they were taken down to Mineral County and released outside the town of Creed. And they apparently liked it there and did really well. And in the next 2 years, 92 and 93, 89 more moose were moved from North Park, some from Utah and some from Wyoming, and they were taken down and turned loose in this Rio Grande headwater drainage area as well. And they've been dispersing from there and populating other areas, and it's sort of been working. In 1995, the Colorado General Assembly took a vote, and they officially designated Walden as the moose viewing capital of Colorado. Remember that detail when we get to the point of summarizing all of this. In 2005, 2007, 91 more moose were moved to and released on Grand Mesa to try and get them established over in west central Colorado. The first time they did it, there was some mortality there and the moose didn't do well, but they sort of nudged things and worked things to try and do a better job of it, and the moose after that did just fine. And now moose are doing fine up on Grand Mesa. In 2009, 19 moose from Utah and 20 moose from North Park were captured and moved and released in the White River drainage not far from Meeker in Rio Blanco County, and that helped get the moose established over there. So that brings us to year 2020, today. Right now, the best available estimates that are based on some groundwork, some aerial surveys, radio tracking, the best guess is that we have about 2,500 moose in Colorado. So from 1978 to 2020, in 42 years, we have gone from 0 moose in Colorado to over 2,000 in the state. So what's my take on this? This is important because it represents political change, cultural change, biological, ecological change, biogeographical change, and we need to understand these things. Moosing, the recreation of taking family and friends from out of state up to the mountains to go see a moose, to go photograph moose, to go show the kids and grandkids moose, moosing. And birding, in my estimation, based on what I have studied, collectively elevated wildlife watching to a level above hunting in terms of economic impact. In 2010, our state wildlife agency gave out questionnaires and interviewed a lot of people on their wildlife interests, and those were published online in 2011. And what we found out was that people who watch wildlife without shooting it, without hunting, actually account for about twice as much economic impact in the state of Colorado as do hunters and fishers combined. the glory of seeing this moose with these enormous antlers and watching them stand there and feed on a willow, and to watch them ruminating and to hear them snorting and grunting, and then to see a cow with some calves dash across the trail while you're hiking. This has thrilled people. And people are willing to go on vacations and to travel and to take trips. They rent cars and they hire guides and they stay in hotels and lodges and beds and breakfasts, and they buy film. Well, not anymore. They buy cameras and microchips to go in them. And all of that has economic impact. This town of Walden is more than happy to have the moose there. So there you have it. How wildlife history got me into moosing, and how moosing made me a better naturalist by getting me to link history with biology and take the two of them very seriously. And yes, that is me just 2 summers ago up at Trap Lake off of the Long Draw Road, and that moose was out there just feeding away, and I was standing there watching it, and there was a fisherman there, and I got the fisherman to use my camera to photograph me watching the moose, and you can see the moose is terrified, or actually it really isn't. So there you go, the story of becoming a naturalist and the role a moose had to play in that whole story. Now, as I understand it, there is a way for you folks to ask questions by typing them in, and the host here at Farr Library, Kazi Jesterbeck, is going to handle all that. And if you want to type in questions, you can do that. She'll tell me what they are, and then I'll answer them for you. So if you have questions, now's the time to do that. Of course, if you don't have questions, I could give you a quiz.
Grand Mesa for moose at the end of this month.
Mm-hmm.
That's a question.
Yeah, the end of August is a really good time to be looking for moose, because the cows are not as aggressive about defending calves as they are in May, June, and July. And so they're a lot more tolerant, more likely to just watch and not get so snotty. And the bulls haven't started the breeding season yet, and so they're not showing, usually in August, early September, they're not showing the signs of aggression that go along with the breeding season. By the end of September on into the first week of November, that's a really good time to stay away from the bull moose, because they go after shrubs and trees and rocks and each other. They go after cattle, they go after small cars, garbage cans, lawn chairs. So that's not the best time to be out moosing. But end of August should be a really great time.
I was in Rocky Mountain National Park the day before it reopened this spring, and before the reservation system was in place, I saw 3 moose frolicking in large puddles, small ponds in the park.
Mm-hmm.
Juveniles in a group. What do you say? That's from Maryland.
They're probably yearlings, last year's youngsters. They tend to hang out together and form small groups. They won't be as robust bodied. They won't look as deep in the chest and as bulging in the ribs as the adults are. So they have that physique that says they're youngsters instead of adults. And they can stay together for 2 to 3 years before they sort of drift apart. And so it wouldn't be surprising to see that sort of thing this time of year.
Do moose usually just have one calf, or is it more common for them to have 2 or more?
Yeah. Moose will have twins, and they even have triplets. And a couple of things really have a lot to do with that. One is the nutritional health of the cow at the time she's impregnated. If her nutritional health is really high, then the rate of twinning can escalate from 1.5% to 3% all the way up to 11% of the cows giving twins. The triplets
is usually never quite that high. Triplets, it's more like 0.5% of the cows or 1% doing triplets. If the females are in really poor nutrition at the time they're impregnated, there's almost no chance of twins or triplets at all. So for most of the population, the single birth is the rule, but twins aren't that uncommon to come across. You do see it.
What is the ecological benefit of the moose? And, if you want a two-part, how many stay together in a group and for how long?
Yeah. Let's take the group stuff, the sociology of moose first. They're not genial animals with each other, but they get to the point they're comfortable with both cattle and horses. And you can drive around in the high country of Colorado and see where there are herds of cattle out grazing, and there'll be a moose on this side and there'll be a moose on that side, and the cattle don't care about the moose and the moose don't care about the cattle, but the moose aren't together necessarily. So generally, it's bachelors in the wintertime that hang together, 2, 3, 4, not unusual. Cows with their calves will stay together through the winter, and then come spring, when the cows are ready to give birth again, they'll let the youngsters know it's okay to be moving on and get out of here. But you don't see moose in large groupings of 20, 30, 100, or 200 the way you do deer and elk. They're not social in those regards. In terms of their ecological benefit, that is a hotly arguable idea down here in Colorado, because there's no evidence whatsoever that moose have lived in this area since the glacial melt-off. They're often referred to as periglacial species, meaning peri means around and glacial means the glacier. So periglacial means they live in this band that develops around these massive glacier areas, and those areas have very specific kinds of plant growth. And when the moose get involved with that, they help regulate the diversity of plant life, because they not only eat the willow twigs, but they also get the fruits and the seeds. They eat wildflowers and seeds, and then as they wander around, they pass those seeds and their droppings, and that helps disperse the plant life and maintain plant diversity. But if the moose in Colorado all died out at glacial times and were not naturally occurring here, then they are not a naturally occurring ecological component in Colorado's ecosystems. And so determining the role that they're playing is a bit dicey. If you go up to places like Rocky Mountain National Park in the Kawanichi Valley and other places, Long Draw Road off of the Cameron Pass Road is a really good place to go look. And where the moose move in after a few years, they can have eaten these willows that are normally 15, 16 feet tall, and they're eaten down to where they're just 2 foot tall stubs. Well, there are birds and mammals that breed and nest in those willow thickets. We call them willow cars. And when the willows are demolished, those species can't nest there. And there are wildflowers that grow in those willow cars. And when the willows are demolished, too much sunlight and those wildflowers disappear. And so it's not as if the moose are demolishing Colorado ecosystems, but they're not exactly harmless either. And that's why having a hunting season to help minimize the population in certain areas is probably a good idea.
What are the average dimensions of moose? Height? So you talked about the weight, I know.
On the Shiras moose that we have here, a typical bull reaching breeding maturity at about 5 years of age, 4 to 5 years, its hump at the shoulder is going to be right around 5.5 to 6 feet. On the biggest of the mooses up in Alaska and over in Asia, it can be nudging 7 feet at the shoulder. And from the tip of the snout to the end of what little bitty tail that they actually have, they can be in the vicinity of 8 feet long. And like I said, here in Colorado, a big bull is going to weigh in at 1,200 pounds. So most of them are in the vicinity, give or take, of 1,000 pounds. So that gives you the idea of how high they are at the shoulder and then how long they are nose to rump and how much they weigh. Cows, a bit smaller than that. They aren't as robust in the chest. They aren't as big around in the rib cage area. They aren't as tall at the shoulder. So they're a bit easier to pick out. And if there are antlers on the head, it's got to be a bull because cows don't grow antlers.
Did you see the moose in Greeley last year along the Poudre Trail? I wish.
No, I didn't, but I came looking for it twice, and both times I found droppings and I found hoof prints, but I didn't see the moose itself. And there have been a couple in the last 2 or 3 years that have wandered into Fort Collins. One was even out by the interstate in Fort Collins, and I didn't go looking for those, but I had friends that sent me smartphone images and said, I'm standing by this place and there's this moose. See, you can see it on my phone. So yeah, they do wander down into town, and those are usually the youngsters that are told by the adult bulls, go find your own backyard. This one's already mine. This one's where I want to live.
Would the introduction of the wolf in the state be detrimental, to the moose population?
You do not want to open up this question with me, but since you have, I'll try to be short and to the point. Moose and wolves coexisted as predator and prey for 1 million years or longer. And when people came to North America from Europe, that was when we started seeing the declines of animals like elk in the eastern part of North America. And it was people that brought the prey species to a bare minimum. In the 1970s, we had this thing called an energy crisis, as you remember, with Jimmy Carter. And it prompted a lot of funding to do research on how energy moves through a food chain from one food level to another, from prey to predator, and so on. Well, if you look at ecology textbooks prior to the 1970s, they all talk about how predator species suppressed prey populations and prevented them from getting too high. But once we started looking at the flow of energy through these food chains and then food webs, it became obvious that the predators don't control the prey populations control the predator populations. So if the prey population is up, the predator population comes up with it. If the prey population goes down, then the prey population goes down too. So it's way different than what we thought it was up into the 1970s. Is there any chance that the gray wolf is going to eliminate the moose from Colorado? No chance at all. It's not going to happen. Ecologically, those two are salt and pepper. And so it is an argument that has absolutely no basis in ecological knowledge or biological fact. Have I made myself clear?
Will a moose attack a bear?
I have not actually seen it, but I was up in the North Park area, off in one of the areas over in the park range, and I found this site where there was a mud hole, and it looked like it had been a sumo wrestling match. And when I got to looking around, there were bear tracks, and there were moose tracks, and there was bear fur on the ground, and it was obvious that a moose and a bear had had a tussle, but there was no way for me to know whether it was an old boar bear or a sow bear protecting cubs, or whether it was just an aggressive bull moose. But it told me, yep, bears and moose can get into it and they can have issues. So yeah, I don't think a black bear would ever try to go after an adult moose because of the size of the animal, but a hungry black bear might try to go after a calf and end up by having a moose come after it. And moose can kick really powerfully, enough to break bones. So, yep, I've seen one sign of a bear and a moose having an encounter. I just kind of wish I'd have been there to see it. It is so nice to be back. I wish you were here, but we'll see you again another day. Bye.